This is part 3 of setting up window datasets in vsHome. During this video, I will be going through how to set up the parameters for specific window types such as casements, tilts and turns, single and double doors, as well as bifold and patio doors. Completing this section will determine how the window system is constructed and will ensure that the model provides a visual representation and cost that is as accurate as possible. And you can add and customize options to cater for various specifications such as profile sizes, frame reinforcing, glazing bead arrangement, as well as hardware options, including trickle vents, window and door handles. So firstly, we need to go into the preferences using the globe icon in the top right corner. Then select window datasets and datasets within that. And we're going to continue to work on the 70mm window system we've been developing in part 1 and 2. So just select that and hit edit. Now I'm going to start with casements. You can double click the folder to expand it and reveal the various options available. Each window type will have a dedicated folder which contains the same basic options with some minor differences where required to cater for the details that are specific to that type of window. So I'm going to start by filling in the general properties for casements. The first section within general properties is labelled connections, where we can determine whether the outer frame or sash frames are mitered or square cut, and whether the transom and mullion ends are arrow-headed or square cut, using the drop-down menus provided. I'm going to leave them set to mitered and arrow-headed, as this is pretty much standard. Remember, like we said in part 1 and 2, you will need to check with your manufacturer for accurate specifications and measurements, as the details I will be inputting are purely for tutorial purposes. So next we move on to shape and style below. Equal sight line only. If yes is selected, then all fixed panes will be exchanged for dummy sashes so that the sight lines remain consistent between the fixed and opening parts of the windows. Now I'm going to leave it set to no. How the sashes sit relative to frames gives us the option to switch from overlapping to flush. Both options are depicted below in the diagrams, and I'm going to leave it set to overlapping. Chamfer outer frames and transoms allows you to choose either a chamfered or square cut finish to the edge of the profiles, and if you select no, you will square them off. Overriding the frame depth will allow you to alter the standard depth from that which has been specified within the system properties. In this case, it's 70mm. Some window types within a given system may require a wider frame depth to the rest of the system. For example, patio doors tend to be wider to allow sashes to slide side by side. Glass chamfer to inside. You can see next to the text the A in brackets. We can then refer to the diagrams below to see what element this represents. In this case, it's the depth of the chamfer on the inside edge of the outer frames and sash profiles. Glass chamfer to outside relates to the depth of the chamfer on the outside edge of the sash, as indicated by the letter B within the diagrams below. Sash chamfer relates to the depth of the chamfer on the outside edge of the sash profile, where this overlaps the outer frame, as indicated by the letter C within the diagram below. Flush sash gap. This will only be relevant if you have selected the flush option from within the sash sit relative to the frames drop-down menu above. This relates to the gap between the outside edge of the flush sash and the outer frame. And as with all these measurements, you will need to refer to your manufacturer again for accurate measurements. I'm just going to change that back to overlapping. Sash offset from touching frame face. Again, this will only apply if choosing the overlapping option, and relates to how much the sash profile sits beyond the outside edge of the outer frame. Depth of sash frames allows us to override the depth of the sash profile in the same way as the frame depth can be overridden. Unless specified, the depth of the sash and frame will be the same, in this case 70mm. Some window types within a given system may require a slimmer sash depth to the rest of the system. For example, flush, sashes and patio doors. Decoding refers to the costing area, specifically costing by style, and we will be covering this later in this series of video tutorials. Okay, so now we can move on to the frame options, which you will find underneath the general properties on the left here. Frame options refers to the outer frame of the window and allows options to be added, costed and customized to cater for various specifications which relate to the window frame as a whole. Two typical options to create for this section would be frame reinforcing and a glazing bead arrangement. Now we have two options within this section. We can create an on-off choice, which simply means the option is either included or not, or we can create a list, which is basically multiple choice. So for the frame reinforcing options, we are going to select Create On-Off, which brings up the Create New Frame Options window. So we're going to name it Frame Reinforcing. And I'm going to leave it set to User Property Type 1. Just to make you aware, the user property type will need to be changed each time you create a new frame or window option. So the next one we create for the glazing bead will be user property 2 and so on. This will ensure that each option has a unique ID within the software. Before we continue, I just want to make it clear that a lot of these options will not be relevant in some cases as the content is generic throughout these sections. Color mapping type creates an association between profile color and the frame or window options you are adding, such as window handle color, for example, and I'm going to leave it set to none as it's not relevant in this case. Quantity calculation relates to how the software figures out how many of this particular item to create. You can choose to either apply one item per frame or one item per each piece of glass within any given frame. I'm going to leave it set to always 1. Discount ID can be used to switch from standard to undiscounted and will allow you to decide whether or not to apply discount to the costs of your frame and window options. Cost calculation type refers to how you calculate the cost of the option. As you can see on the drop-down menu, there are various options to choose from. In most cases, the cost of windows and doors will be calculated by using a style matrix. However, it is possible to input linear cost of each item in order to calculate a material cost. As most installers will use a matrix, I'm going to select Basic Matrix Percentage of, and then input a percentage of 5%, which will uplift the matrix cost of each frame to cater for the frame reinforcing. Apply Finish Markups allows you to decide whether or not to apply any finish markups you may have set up to the cost of your frame or window options. I'm leaving this box unticked. Default choice allows you to decide whether the frame or window option is switched on or off by default. There is also a third option, always on, which will mean that the option cannot be turned off within the model. I'm leaving this set to off so that I can decide when I want frame reinforcing to be included. Include in frame specification just means the option will be listed within the reports. You can choose from always, never, or only if on. I'm leaving it set to always. Show in the GUI refers to whether or not the option will appear within the graphical user interface, or in other words, within the edit area, and will allow the option to be switched on and off within the model. I'm leaving this option ticked. Double handle refers to when there are two sets of handles required on double and bifolding doors, and therefore will not be relevant in this case. So again, I shall leave the box unticked. Multi-option default gives the choice to have more than one option as default. As we are creating an on-off option, this will also not be relevant in this case, so I will leave the box unticked. Okay, so that's all done. Now I can select OK. Once the item has been created, you will be able to edit the attributes below. And now I'm going to create the glazing bead. So for this item, we'll be selecting the create list option, as we want the option to choose between internal or external glazing bead. So firstly, I need to input the name. This will now be user property 2. The color mapping type again is irrelevant. Unlike the frame reinforcing, I don't intend to apply any cost to the glazing bead, as I want the cost of the windows and doors to remain the same regardless of the glazing bead arrangement. As such, the next 3 options relating to quantity, cost calculations and markup will be irrelevant, so I will leave the default options selected. We want the option to show in the GUI, so we can change the glazing bead arrangement within the model. And the remaining 3 options will also be irrelevant in this case, so again I'm going to leave the default options selected for these. Okay, so now we need to input the multi-choice options, and to do that we move down to the section at the bottom and select create. All I need to do is to create the 2 options, internal and external bead. So firstly, name the option. I'm leaving the discount ID set to standard, as the cost is set to 0, as we are not applying any cost to this option. Color is irrelevant in this case, so we will leave the default Y option selected, and I will set the internal bead as the default option by ticking the box provided. Select OK, and then move on to the external bead. Start by inputting the name. All the options will be left as they are, and I won't be ticking the default option for the external bead, as we've already determined the internal bead as default. Okay, so this is now finished and I can hit OK. We can now move on to the window options located directly below the frame option here on the left. Window options refers to the opening part of the window, also known as the sash, and allows options to be added, costed and customized to cater for various specifications which relate to the opening part of the window only. 2 typical options to create within here would be window handle color and trickle vents. So I'm going to start with the window handle color using the create list option. So we have multiple options to select from. Again, start by inputting the name. In relation to the property type, if we actually scroll down to the bottom of the list, there are some dedicated options which cater for most common types of window options. And in this case, I can then select window handle. Always check to see if there is a relevant option to choose from, rather than selecting property 1, 2, 3, etc. The color mapping type is now relevant, and I'm going to select map to internal color, as window handles are generally on the inside. Cost calculation type will be fixed, so a fixed value applies to each handle. And in this case, I'm going to leave the rest of the options as per the defaults. Now we need to input the multi-choice options by clicking the Create button down here. It's essential that you have already inputted the hardware colors, as we showed in part 1 of this series of video tutorials. Now I'm going to start by inputting the name for white. The discount ID will be standard. I'm going to set the cost to £2.50. As with all costings within the window datasets, this value relates to the cost you buy the product for and not the selling price. The software will apply any relevant markups you have set up via the cost entities in order to calculate your final selling price. Ensure to check with your manufacturer for accurate costings, as the values I am adding are purely for tutorial purposes only. Select the relevant option from the color drop-down menu, and I'm going to set the white as default and hit OK. Then I'm going to repeat the process for gold, chrome and painted. Okay, so that's finished, and now we can hit OK. And now we're going to move on to the trickle vent, and again we need to use the create list option and start by inputting the name. I'm going to select User Property 3, as if we scroll down, there is no relevant option for a trickle vent. And I'm going to leave the remaining options as per the defaults. So now we can hit Create and input the different options we want to appear for the trickle vent. So the first option I'd like to input is an option for no trickle vent. So I'm just going to start by inputting the name None. Set this as a default and leave all the other options as they are with 0 cost. Second option I'm going to create is Slimline 2000. This time with an associated cost of £2.50. Again, these figures are purely for tutorial purposes, and hit OK. And finally, I'm going to create a Slimline 4000 option, this time with an associated cost of £5, and hit OK. Okay, so now that's done, we can hit OK. And now we can move on to the outer frames, Transoms, Mullions, and Sashes. So here we can add and customize multiple profile options relating to each section, with options to input the overall width of the profile, as well as glazing and sash deductions, and also assign a cost to each profile if required. If you do not intend to use a style matrix in order to calculate the cost of your windows and doors, then you will need to associate either a fixed cost to each profile or a cost per linear meter, following the same process we used for the boundary components. As we are using a style matrix, for the sake of this video tutorial, I will not be applying any costs to the profiles. Okay, so starting with outer frames, I'm going to start by hitting Create. Another thing to remember here, as I've said before, all the measurements I will be inputting are purely for the tutorial, and you will need to check with your manufacturer. So I'm going to start with a 50mm outer frame. Remember, we are not associating any costs with these items as we are using a style matrix, so I'm going to jump straight to the physical settings. We can refer down to the diagrams at the bottom here in order to determine what each of the physical settings relates to. So it will be a 50mm width, which relates to the overall size of the profile. This software will use this measurement in order to accurately scale the size of the profile within the model. I'm going to set a 13mm glass deduction, which relates to the amount of engagement between the glass and the outer frame. The software will use this measurement in order to calculate the glazing area for each window so that the cost of the glazing is accurate. And then I'm going to input a 28mm sash deduction, which relates to the amount of engagement or overlap between the sash and outer frame profiles. The software will use this additional deduction when calculating the glazing area within the sashes or opening parts of the window. Many window systems will offer a range of outer frames and transom sizes. So now we're going to repeat this process for 60mm and 70mm outer frames. The glass and sash deduction will be the same throughout. So I'm just going to speed through this part. However, I will be setting the 60mm option as default. Okay, so now I can move on to the transoms. The glass and sash deduction will be the same as the outer frames, and I'm going to create a 72 and 87mm transom with the 72mm option as default. Now Mullions, which will be the same as transoms. Now on to sashes, We're going to create a 70mm T sash and a 69mm Z sash. Remember, we're not associating any costs as we are using a style matrix. Now, something new here we need to determine is under what circumstances the T sash will be used. So we do that by using the availability option here. Select edit. It's important that you have already set up your frame options here, otherwise you won't be able to do this. Then using the availability control, we can set how the T sash will be used. Select if option value selected. Option set to frame options. Option to test against glazing bead. And then select the internal bead and hit OK. This now means that the T sash will only be available when the internal bead frame option is selected. So the width will be 76.5mm. And the glass deduction again will be 13mm. Now the 69mm Z sash. Select edit for the availability option again. Then using the availability control window, we can set how the Z sash will be used. So select if option value selected, frame options, glazing bead, and this time select external bead and press OK. And this now means that the Z sash will only be available when the external bead frame option is selected. I'm going to set the width to 68.5mm. And again, the glass deduction is 13. Okay. Finally, the costing section is one of the areas where we can start to create a style matrix in order to cater for the overall cost of each window or door. However, we will be covering how to create and customize your style matrices later in this series of video tutorials. So I'm just going to skim past this folder. Okay, so now we've completed the casements. The remaining window types such as tilt and turns and gables are filled in with very similar information, if not the same, making alterations for specific profiles for tilt and turn windows. So I'm going to jump forward to the doors, as this is where the differences start to occur. The information within the general properties will be the same as the casement, so I'm going to move straight to the frame options and begin to set up the frame reinforcing and glazing bead arrangement. And I'm just going to speed through this process as the information is the same as before. The user type will start again as we are within a new folder for doors this time. And then hit OK. Okay, moving on to door options. I'm going to create an option for door handle colour and trickle vent, which are very similar to those we created within the window options. In addition, I will also be creating options for door hinge colour and letterboxes, which are specific specifications relating to doors only. Starting with the door handle colour, I'm going to select Create List, input the name door handle, and we can select door handle from the property type drop-down menu. Colour mapping, I'm going to set to external colour and leaving the remaining options as per their defaults. However, this time we will be using the double handle option, which refers to when there are two sets of handles required on double and bifolding doors to cater for both the master and slave doors. Now I can hit Create and input the multi-choice options for white, gold, chrome and painted. Okay, and now I'm going to create the trickle vent option using the create list button again. Exactly the same info as the casement, so I'm going to speed through. Now I can hit OK. Now for the door hinge, select the create list option and input the name. Select door hinge from the property type drop-down menu. Colour mapping is going to be set to external colour, and the remaining options will be left as per their defaults. And I'm going to select create and create the options for white, gold, chrome and painted. Now for the letterbox option, select the create list option again, inputting the name letterbox. And select user property 4 as there's no specific option here. Colour mapping type will be again mapped to external colour, and the remaining options will be left set as their defaults. And I'm going to select create and input options for white, gold, chrome and painted again. Also an option for none, which will be set as default. Okay, so now moving on to the outer frames. Now again, this information will be the same as the casements, except we are setting a 70mm outer frame as default because doors use a large outer frame as standard. We will also be creating a 30mm low threshold option, which will sit at the bottom of the door. So let me just quickly whiz through the 50, 60 and 70mm options first. Now we get to the 30mm low threshold option. What makes this option different is we will be using the specific location option to determine which part of the outer frame it will be applied to. This option would be useful for doors which require wheelchair access, for instance. So I'm going to start by inputting the name. Select the sill from the specific location drop-down menu to ensure it is only available in this location. The width, of course, will be 30mm, and the same measurements for the glass and sash deduction. This time, we want to select the box for always square cut ends due to the difference in width of the outer frame compared to the low threshold. Okay. Now we move on to transoms, mullions and sashes, both of which are the exact same as the casement sections we filled in earlier, except the doors require the 87mm transom set as default and an additional large 107mm mid-rail option included. So I'm going to start by inputting the 72mm transom. Okay, now we can move on to the mullions. For the sash, we only need to create one for doors, and there will be no default. Finally, we move on to the specials, which relate to bespoke profiles such as floating mullions. To cater for the floating mullion, I'm going to replicate the 72mm mullion. Okay, so now we've completed the door section, I'm going to move on to bifold doors. The general properties have a few differences within the shape and style section. To begin with, the majority of bifolding door systems use a flush sash arrangement with a gap between the outside edge of the flush sash and the outer frames. Similar gaps or separations are also required between individual sashes, and the size of the separation may change depending on the configuration of the sashes. Therefore, there are a number of additional fields included within the shape and style section dedicated to each combination, including opening, hinged, and sliding. Furthermore, not all bifold doors require a floating mullion, and those that do may require mullions in different locations depending on the shape of the profile or the type of hardware. Some systems may require a floating mullion between all sashes that meet at track roller hinge location, while others may only require a floating mullion where there is a single sliding sash. This arrangement is controlled by the floating mullion creation drop-down menu, along with a couple of additional fields dedicated to the width of the floating mullion and the gaps between the mullion and sashes. As with all other specifications within the window datasets, ensure to check with your manufacturer regarding the necessary floating mullion arrangement and gaps between the flush sashes and outer frames. So for the sake of this video, I am going to set the flush sash gap to 12mm, but I just need to adjust the drop-down menu for how the sashes sit relative to frames to flush, and you'll see that the flush sash gap is now available to edit. And I'm going to set the floating mullion creation drop-down menu to only single leaf track roller hinges, which means there will only be a floating mullion where there is a single sliding sash. All the additional fields dedicated to the amount of separation between the sashes will also be set to 12mm, with the exception of any that relate to a sliding panel, which will need larger separations to allow for the floating mullions. These separations will need to be increased by 30mm to allow for the width of the floating mullion plus a further 12mm for the gap between the mullion and the sash, a total of 54mm. This will then be doubled to 108mm for the sliding panel to sliding panel separation. Finally, the field relating to the width of the sash gasket should also be set to 12mm in order to fill the gap between the sashes when the bifolding door is viewed within the model. All the frame and door options should be completed with the same information as the standard doors, including frame reinforcing, glazing bead, door handle and hinge colour, etc. The outer frame and sash profile options relating to the bifold door should also be inputted following the same process used for casement and doors. Do take note that most systems will have dedicated profiles for bifolding doors which could differ in size and have different measurements relating to the glazing and sash deductions. So having said that, I'm just going to input the data that I've just explained. Okay, so now that's done, we can move on to patio doors. The main thing we want to do here is override the sash depth in the general properties to change it to 59mm. The sash offset should also be increased to 25mm. And the sliding sash overlap should be set to 80mm. Which relates to the width of the patio sash profile. These changes will ensure that the patio sashes can slide beside each other while maintaining an overall frame depth of 70mm. As with bifolding doors, all the frame and door options should be completed with the same information as the standard doors, including frame reinforcing, glazing bead, and door handle colour, etc. However, in the case of patio doors, there will be no need for an option for door hinge, trickle vent, or letterboxes. The outer frame and sash profile options relating to the patio door should also be inputted following the same process used for casements and doors. And remember, most systems will have dedicated profiles for patio doors, which could differ in size and have different measurements relating to the glazing and sash deductions. Okay, so that's everything. At this point, we should save the window dataset, hit yes. We can close down the preferences, and what I'm going to do is restart the software so the changes can take effect. Okay, so having just restarted the software, I'm going to open up a model that I've already created to give you a demonstration on how the frame, window and door options can be altered, as well as changes to the various profile sizes, including the outer frame and transom. So firstly, if we go to the side elevation and select the opening window, you will see the frame and window options appear on the right hand side in the edit area. Here we can turn the frame reinforcing on or off. We can also select between the internal and external glazing bead. Then if we move down to the window options, we can choose between the trickle vent options we created and select the different colour window handle options. So I'm just going to give you an example of that. We can use the Apply Edits to drop-down menu and select Complete Model. And then by selecting gold, it will apply the gold handle to the complete model. You'll see them there. And then if we select the transom, you will see the option to change the transom from a 72mm as default to an 87mm thicker transom. And again, if I just go back to the 72mm, use the Apply Edits to drop-down menu to Complete Model, change back to 87, and you'll see it has applied the thicker transoms to the whole model. Okay, now if we just zoom in a little bit and select the outer frame, and again, using the Apply Edits to drop-down menu, we can determine whether we apply the edits to the complete model, the complete frame, or just this one profile. So I'm going to leave it set to complete model, and we can just choose between the options we created there. Finally, if we move on to the door, and select the outer frame, in particular the sill, you will see it is currently mitered as we've got the 70mm outer frame set as default. So if I use the Apply Edits to drop-down menu and select just this profile, then I can use the Profile Type drop-down menu to select the 30mm low threshold option, and then by turning the sill off, can just zoom out a bit and then take a look from the inside of the model. You will see the benefit of applying the low threshold option to your doors. For more tutorial videos, visit the support area on our website.